Hello, and welcome to Sunday School. Last week, we talked about how Joshua used God's power to knock down the walls of Jericho and get back to the Promised Land. But God made another promise, much before that He would save the world from death that mankind brought on ourselves in the Garden of Eden. And He would do that through a man named Jesus. Jesus was the chosen Messiah, the man who would save the Jewish people, and then the whole world. But even before this, God was planning. He was planning to make Israel into a great nation with a great king. I'm telling you this story to remind you that the Bible is one book, one long true story that goes from creation to Jesus. All of this is part of the same true story. Today, we're going to talk about that king's great-grandmother. We'll get to the king next week. Today's his great-grandmother.
So let's set ourselves in time. This was a pretty long amount of time after Joshua. Think of it this way. Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David, would be thinking about Joshua similarly to how we think about George Washington. So in other words, it's been a while. During the time we'll be talking about, there was a famine in Canaan, the promised land where the Israelites lived. Many people left to find food. A man named Elimelech brought his wife and 2 sons to a place called Moab, where food was still growing. There, people worshipped idols, but Elimelech and his family remained true to God. His sons married Moabite women, named Orpah and Ruth. But not long after, Elimelech and his sons died. The famine, however, was over. So Naomi, Elimelech's widow, prepared to head home to Bethlehem. Orpah stayed in Moab, but Ruth, now believing in the true God, went with her. Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, where they went to live near the farm of a man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi. They were allowed to pick up any food the farmers left behind, so they didn't starve. While Ruth was out in the field, picking up the leftover wheat, Boaz came out to inspect the workers. He spoke to them kindly and was clearly a good man of God. Boaz was so impressed with Ruth's hard work that he had the farmers leave the best crops for Ruth so she could take them home to Naomi. Naomi was amazed by how much food Ruth brought home. Naomi sent Ruth to a party that Boaz was having to celebrate the harvest. There, by the grace of God, they decided to get married. They had a son and named him Obed.
Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. David was one of the most important kings of Israel, arguably the most important of all. And he was also an ancestor of Jesus Christ. So why did I take you on this long story about Ruth, who was just a random woman who was related to Jesus? For 2 reasons. First, to show you that there are no random people. Ruth, despite not even being an Israelite, was a follower of God who became part of the bloodline of Jesus. Anybody from anywhere can be part of God's plan. We'll explore that even more next week. The other reason was to remind you that the Bible is a long, true story. Sure, there are parts full of action and excitement, the plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the collapse of Jericho, but there are also parts where people just live their lives. The Bible is the whole story of God's plan. Today's story came from the whole book of Ruth. Instead of questions about the story, today I'll leave you with this. Think about times in your life that maybe God has used you and you didn't even know it. Next week, we'll talk about King David.